I'll call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to order. This is a new meeting, following on from the work we did this morning. So we'll start with reviewing and adopting the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda? Mr. Simpson, all those in favor? Thank you. The agenda is adopted. Declaration of conflicts of interest. Hearing none, we'll move into today's committee business. Public meeting with Jamie Cooey, Comptroller General, to review the public accounts of the Government of the Northwest Territories 2017 to 2018. Before we begin with Mr. Cooey's presentation, we'll have committee members introduce themselves for the record, and I'll start with Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Welcome, Julie Green, Yellowknife Centre.
Good afternoon, Michael Nodley, MLA for Detchel.
Good afternoon. Welcome, Shane Thompson, Nahindi.
RJ Simpson, MLA, Hay River North.
And I'm Kieran Testart, member for Cam Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. With me at the table are Jennifer Frankie Smith, our committee clerk, and April Taylor, our committee research advisor. Welcome back, Mr. Cooey. If you can, you may proceed with your opening remarks and introduce your witnesses for the record. Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for inviting us before committee to discuss the 2018 public accounts of the Government of Northwest Territories. With me today from the Department of Finance is Mr. Walter Mupedziskwa, Manager of Financial Reporting, and Ms. Tegwin Jones, Assistant Director, Reporting, Treasury and Risk Management. Also with us is Lindsay Dempsey, Senior Financial Reporting Advisor. The public accounts represent one of the key accountability mechanisms of the GNWT. The accounts present the financial position of the consolidated government reporting entity as at March 31st, 2018, and the results of operations for the fiscal year ended on March 31st, 2018. The accounts provide a reader additional information through notes and schedules. In addition to the financial statements, the accounts provide information about key financial indicators on the general financial condition of the GNWT, including assessing if the government met the requirements of its fiscal responsibility policy. The accounts also include the non-consolidated financial statements of the GNWT, which presents the financial position and operating results of the GNWT departments and Legislative Assembly. The government reporting entity, which is presented in the consolidated accounts, include the core GNWT, all public agencies, and other controlled entities other than the Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission. The consolidated accounts are audited by the Office of the Auditor General. The auditor's report overall is a clean, positive opinion, noting continued progress by the GNWT over prior years. The 2018 consolidated accounts include an operating surplus of $161 million, which is comprised of revenues of $2.06 billion and expenses of $1.9 billion. The annual surplus is used primarily for investment in capital infrastructure and paying down debt. During the year, the GNWT invested $304 million into capital infrastructure. The consolidated cash position increased by $19 million from $117 million to $136 million within public agencies, while the GNWT has $279 million in short-term loans as at March 31st, 2019, an increase of $62 million over the prior year. Overall borrowing, as defined by the NWT Borrowing Act, was $904 million, which resulted in the government's residual borrowing capacity being $396 million as at March 31st, 2018. The financial statement discussion and analysis portion of the accounts summarizes the government's consolidated financial results as at March 31st, 2018. Although the GNWT had an operating surplus, the GNWT does have limited flexibility to raise financial resources and has vulnerabilities related to revenue sources, which requires a need for careful fiscal management. That concludes my opening remarks. At this time, if committee agrees, I'd like to go through a short presentation to provide some detail on the accounts and as well government's actions towards the committee's recommendations on their review of the 16-17 public accounts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cooey. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the presentation, I'd like to go through a little bit of the timing of the 17-18 public accounts, some of the financial highlights, some of the challenges, slide on environmental liabilities, then go into the government action on the 16-17 SCOGO recommendations on the public accounts, and then a brief overview of where we're at with the 18-19 public accounts. On slide 3 on the timing, the interim financial statements were completed by September 30th as required under the FAA. They were provided to committee on August 28th, 2018. So these interim financial statements were provided to committee within the timeframes committed to by the Minister of Finance, which is August 31st each year, to assist with business plan review. The public accounts were signed on October 18th as compared to October 26th of the previous year. They were released publicly on the Department of Finance website on October 31st and then tabled in the Legislative Assembly on November 1st. This was the first time in many years the accounts were tabled in this session as compared to being released on November 7th and tabled on February 13th for the previous year. Slide 4, a little bit of the highlights on the consolidated financial highlights. On this slide, it's important to note that these figures on this page are on a consolidated basis, which includes public agencies and controlled entities. So these numbers would differ from figures committee members and staff would see from the Minister of Finance with respect to the fiscal strategy, which is for government departments alone. For revenues, actual revenues were $2.06 billion, a decrease of $37 million or 1.8% from the original budget. This is $17 million or 0.8% lower than the prior year. The decrease in both budget and actuals is related to the decrease in personal and corporate income taxes. For operational expenditures, actual expenses were $1.9 billion, a decrease of $34 million or 1.8% from the original budget. Total operational expenses are comparable to prior year. The difference would equal your operating surplus or deficit. The consolidated surplus was $161 million, which is $14 million or 8% less than the prior year. A little bit about cash provided by operations. This would generally be the operating surplus less non-cash amortization, which is included in operating expenses. So your cash provided by operations is $282 million. Leads you to capital investment financing activities, which is primarily comprised of the planned capital spending, which was $304 million in the year. That would equal your change in cash position at the end of the year. Public agencies had cash of around $136 million as at March 31st, 2018, while the GNP incurred short-term loans of $297 million. On to slide 5, a little bit about the challenges. So the audit of the consolidated public accounts is complex. It spans over about 6 months, post-March 31st, leading up to signatures in mid-October. It's complex in that completing the non-consolidated statements for the government and then focusing on the consolidation as public agencies submit their financial statements. Some challenges are directly related to the availability of staff due to life events, staff movement. Public agencies, for those same reasons, are also challenged to have their audits and annual reports completed in the legislative timeframes. The Department of Finance, through my office, does provide support to these public agencies throughout the year. Providing advice on legislation and policy continues throughout the year, and advice to public agencies on year-end instructions process, as well as providing update, direction, and assistance as required. Slide 6 on environmental liabilities. So the devolution agreement contains a 5-year timeline for the GNWT to determine if there are any sites listed on Part E of the agreement that the GNWT wish to assert to Canada require remediation as an abandoned operating site. The 5-year timeline ended on March 31st, 2019. Management did send a letter to Canada on March 20th, 2019, asserting that abandoned operating sites existed requiring remediation. In advance of this date, the GNWT performed Phase 1 and 2 environmental site assessments to substantiate the requirement for remediation as required under the devolution agreement. Pursuant to the devolution agreement, the GNWT has undertaken extensive efforts in an attempt to locate or allocate the responsibility for remediation of the site to the last known operator. So the letter was sent on March 20th and did not include remediation costs. It did include 14 sites. Actual full remediation estimates require development of a remediation action plan at a later phase. On the environmental liabilities listing on the finance website, The listing is still on the website, similar to prior years. Does include, on a consolidated basis, all environmental liabilities by location, site type of contamination, and site stage. This year, that was enhanced to include the number of sites to make it easier for a reader to reconcile back to the public accounts. Also, some new disclosure included on page 24 of the consolidated statements was a page adding detail about environmental liabilities in the financial statement and discussion analysis area. I'd like to go through the government actions on the 16-17 SCOGO recommendations with respect to the public accounts. Slide 8. Recommendation 1 was entering into service agreements or a memorandum of understanding with GNDP boards, agencies, or other entities. So what we did was the Office of the Comptroller General reached out to all consolidated entities advising that staff in the Comptroller General's office was available for support and assistance during the financial year-end process. We also sought feedback on the need to formalize this support through an agreement. The entities were also advised of the importance of meeting the deadlines in the legislation and advised of the extension process with request to the Minister of Finance as per the FAA. As members will notice, there was significant improvement in the ability of public agencies to complete their statements and annual reports on time. This year there was 4 extensions requested and approved, and there were 2 entities late submitting compared to 9 entities in the prior year. One of these entities was late this year due to a simple misunderstanding where they believed they had 3 months rather than 90 days per the legislation, so they did submit within 91 days. The other was an ability to hold a board meeting in time to formally accept their statements before they could provide them to us. I'm confident both entities will be within the timeframes next year or will request an extension. So overall, there was significant improvement, and communication lines appeared to be open since we reached out to them. Right now, I'm not seeing a formal need for a formal agreement. The support just continues to be available. However, when there is staff turnover, we need to ensure those relationships are maintained, and we will plan to reach out to make them aware of the requirements and help train them and ensure there's appropriate relationship building. Recommendation 2 is consider bringing all of the information about P3 projects under one note in the consolidated public accounts until such a time as a new accounting standard on P3 projects is put in place. So I feel we made significant progress in consultation with the OAG in this area. We did include a new note which discloses P3 liabilities in the financial statements and also supported by comments in the financial discussion and analysis. The Public Sector Accounting Board continues to move to an accounting standard related to P3, but is likely a few years away from being finalized. So we are committed to working with the OAG as this area develops for disclosure purposes. Slide 9, recommendation number 3 was to make the inventory of contaminated sites available online, modeled upon and with a level of disclosure comparable to the federal contaminated sites inventory maintained by the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. So working with our appropriate governance structures, we did review the Canada website and determined that it requires special software. We are hoping to make some movement in this area during the 18-19 fiscal year. There was an establishment of the Information System Shared Services within the Department of Finance, which could potentially provide us some support from a systems perspective to make advancements. Specifically, we'll be looking towards the feasibility of providing a map. So if users click on an environmental liability site, it would take them to a map of the GNWT on where that site is located. Recommendation number 4 is improve upon the information in the financial statement discussion and analysis section of the public accounts that indicates how the GNWT has met the fiscal responsibility policy provisions related to debt servicing and infrastructure financing. So I'm happy to report that in 17-18, the GNWT did meet the requirements of this fiscal responsibility policy. The table on the fiscal responsibility policy in the financial statement discussion analysis was enhanced to include source references back to pages within the consolidated and non-consolidated public accounts, so a reader could determine where those amounts came from. Also, language within the discussion section between the policy requirements and the financial indicators section was updated to ensure a reader knows when the calculations are completed on a consolidated versus non-consolidated basis in accordance with the policy. Slide 10, recommendation number 5, give consideration to reporting student loan remissions in another schedule and reconsider amending the non-consolidated schedule of bad debt write-offs, forgiveness, and student loan remissions to better protect the privacy of individuals on completion of a privacy impact assessment. So the action we took was the Department of Finance did report the student loan remissions on a standalone schedule in the 17-18 public accounts, separate from the schedule reporting bad debts, write-off, and forgiveness. It is still, however, the Department of Finance's view that this information needs to be disclosed in the public accounts in accordance with the Financial Administration Act and to ensure transparency of these amounts to the public. The privacy impact assessment was completed by the Department of Finance and provided to committee on April 4th, 2018. On to slide 11. A little bit on the 18-19 public accounts. So the 2019 audit is already underway. Interim work began the last week of January 2019. The Office of the Comptroller General is currently working with the departments and public agencies for a timely and accurate year-end close. The GMT will continue to address challenges as they arise in consultation with the Office of the Auditor General. Additionally, the GMT is determining its position related to a future accounting standard, PS 3280, asset retirement obligations, which is effective April 1st, 2018. This is a standard that would impact the liability associated with closing operating sites for tangible capital assets. So our plan is in 1920 to analyze the standard and develop the GMT position, and then in 2021 and 21-22 work to identify and quantify any liabilities. As well as we are also committed to working with the committees on addressing concerns on recommendations as appropriate. Just before questions, I'd like to thank committee and their staff and the OAG for working with us. I think we made significant progress on the public accounts over the last 3 fiscal years. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cooey. Before we turn to committee for comments and questions, I just wanted to thank your office for your collaboration over these past years in working with this committee and taking our recommendations seriously. Turning to our report on the previous public accounts, committee notes that substantial progress or the completion of the recommendations the committee made has been completed by your office, and that's certainly appreciated. And we also note the timeliness is much improved. When speaking with the Office of the Auditor General, the auditor's staff told us that there's been an overall reduction in 500 hours of work in preparing this public accounts report, and they mentioned that had a great deal to do with your office, and timeliness is, of course, very important to this committee. So we do appreciate the work you've done in meeting the recommendations and the work of this committee, and also working with the Auditor General to ensure the timeliness of the public accounts. So thank you very much for that. I'll now turn to committee members. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and I want to reiterate the chair's statements that, often when we get people in front of committee, we're ready to rake them over the coals because they're here because things went wrong. But over the past 3 years, there's been a lot of good things happening with the public accounts, and there's been a lot of good back and forth between the committee and the Comptroller's office, as well as the Auditor General. And I know that you have a good working relationship with the Office of the Auditor General, and that's great to see. And I think that we've made some improvements to help the public understand the public accounts a little better. And I'll note that the Auditor General's office gave you a clean audit opinion, which is, I have to congratulate you on, because not all public sector governments receive those in Canada. I know that there's some who who receive unqualified opinions, or qualified opinions quite often, so good job on that. So I'll start off with a question about what is actually reported in the public accounts. If you go to page 2 of the Consolidated Statement of Operations and Accumulated Surplus, that's page 2 of Schedule 1, it shows expenses of $1.9 billion for 2017-2018. So that's $1.9 billion spent by the GNWT and government-controlled entities. However, if you look at the main estimates, which is the budget that's voted on in the House by all of the members, there's a disparity of about $250 million, because the main estimates we vote on are about $1.7 billion. So there's that gap there, and it's hard for someone looking at what the House voted on to compare it to what is in the public accounts. And so can you explain to us why there is that $250 million disparity? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so the consolidated statements would include the budget and actual expenditures for public agencies. So if you're looking at the main estimate numbers, which would refer back to the Section 2 of the non-consolidated financial statements, and then the consolidated would include expenditures, which include all public agencies and controlled entities of the government. There are some entries that are on consolidation, related party entries that would double count, that are eliminated during that process. But this would include all entities controlled by the government of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So what we vote on in the House doesn't include things like the Power Corporation, and I assume that would probably make up the bulk of this this disparity. Which organizations make up that difference? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the member went to note page 5 of the consolidated statements, in here it does show which entities are consolidated into these consolidated statements. So if you look down page 5, you go through all those entities under the Education Act, the Aurora College Act, the Hospital Insurance and Health and Social Administrations Act, Toledo Community Service Act, Northwest Territories Business Development and Corporation, Investment Corporation, Northwest Territories Housing Corporation, Human Rights, Northwest Territories Society Act, Status of Women Council, Northwest Territory Heritage Fund, the Northwest Territory Waters Act, and Northwest Territory Hydro Corp, so the Power Corp. But that does provide an exhaustive list of all the entities that are consolidated into this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Okay, so which entities make up the budget, the part of the budget that we don't vote on? Because I know that a lot of these entities are funded by appropriations in the House, in the budget. For example, the school districts, we appropriate money through education, culture, and employment that goes to them. So where is that $250 million that we don't vote on? Where is that located in these entities? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So under the Financial Administration Act, all of these entities are required to develop their budgets, get approved by their respective boards, get approved by their respective responsible minister, and then tabled in the Legislative Assembly. So the member is correct, and some of their revenues would come from the government and be appropriated through the main estimates process. However, some of them would have their own source revenues that do not come directly from the government of the Northwest Territories. So I don't have a perfect reconciliation of it right now, but those other monies would come from other funding sources and would be approved through that process under the Financial Administration Act and tabled in the Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So some of the entities we vote on would also have funds coming from elsewhere that wouldn't be in the budget necessarily, but would be recorded in the public accounts. It would not, that $250 million isn't all from one entity, was the impression that I'm getting here. Is that correct?
Mr. Cooey.
That's correct. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So this is a little confusing. Has there been any consideration given to tabling a consolidated budget that is similar to the public accounts? I know the budget that's tabled is non-consolidated, but if we consolidate or we table the consolidated budget with all of those agencies in there with their full budgets, it would be easier for someone to compare the budget at the beginning of the year to the public accounts, so we know that what was intended to be spent, and then we can see what actually was spent. Has there been any consideration given to something like that? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, there's been some consideration to tabling a consolidated budget. It would take some resources to be able to do it. And as I mentioned, under the FAA, all of these budgets are approved and are tabled in the Legislative Assembly. Typically, they need to be approved prior to April 1st under the legislation, and then tabled at the earliest opportunity, which is likely May, June. So there has been some consideration. The earliest we could ever finalize a consolidated budget and table it would be May, June of each year after all those budgets are approved. But that is something that is being considered. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and I think that would have some merit. I understand that they're all tabled individually, but to put them all together and put a total on there so that people can see what the government and the government-controlled entities are spending, I think would be useful for transparency and for helping the public understand what the government is actually doing. So I appreciate your answer, and I'll have some a little later on. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. O'Reilly?
Sure, thanks, Mr. Chair. Let's start with the work on contaminated sites in response to recommendation number 3. Our friends here have indicated that they're prepared to look at setting up some kind of a website where information on contaminated sites might be located. I'm actually looking at what the Yukon government has recently done. There's a map of the Yukon. There's 3 different types of contaminated sites shown, one called contaminated, the other remediated, and the other is unknown. There's dots on a map, and if you hover over one of the dots or you click it open, there's information about the location, a summary of the contamination at the site, dates, the civic address, the community, longitude, land use, and the type of contaminant of concern, and so on. Have our friends been able to look at this website, and is this the kind of model that they anticipate using in the future? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, as mentioned, we are looking at multiple websites. We are looking at what software we have in place already in the GNWT. Now that we do have the Amalgamated Information System Shared Services, it's a little easier to try and access some of that software that already exists within our government and try to utilize that or leverage that with the ability to get this more interactive on a map so that a user could identify where exactly these contaminated sites are in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I appreciate that, and I know that committee had looked at the federal contaminated sites inventory, which provides even more information than what the Yukon does. With the federal site, you can actually see year by year the status of each of the sites, how they transition through the remediation process, and the amount actually spent year by year. Is that the sort of where we might get to in a year or two? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think within the next year, we're really looking to get that map showing. I think there's still a little hesitation to disclose the amount spent and the amounts per lease sites. As in the other procurement, we need to go out to procure to get these sites cleaned up. And, we want to be mindful of the value for money of the government in being mindful of those actual costs. But we are definitely looking to make some movement for a user to know where these sites are in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I recognize that on the Department of Finance website, if you search enough, you can actually find a spreadsheet that is available in PDF as well as Excel with some more information about the contaminated sites that we have liability for. So the idea would be to link that Excel spreadsheet to a map like the way that the federal government or the Yukon government does. Is that what we would be looking at? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's currently what what we're hopeful we can pull off. It's a matter of working with our systems experts to see what kind of software and systems we have available that we can definitely look to make that happen. So we're going to work with them and work with within the realm of their availability and their technology advancements to see where we can get to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a couple more questions on contaminated sites. I noticed that in the spreadsheet inventory that's on the Department of Finance website, that some landfills are found in the inventory. Why? So some of the landfills are there, some are not. Can someone explain what criteria used to determine whether a landfill shows up in the inventory or not? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Mutpedziedzwa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The criteria that we use for disclosing environmental liabilities is based on the environmental liability standard. So basically, that standard looks at non-operating sites. However, we, as a department, we went a step further and say, for the operating sites, if the risk is high, then we also disclose or record the liability for those. So we might have a few landfills that are operating that we recognize the liability because of the risk that we are associated with those sites.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think you mentioned that there's an asset retirement obligation or standard that's being introduced. Would the treatment of landfills change under that new standard? And I think it was on one of your slides. And how might that affect our liability moving forward? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Mutpedziedzwa.
Thank you, Mr. Kui. There is an asset retirement obligation standard which is effective April 1st, 2021. That standard is for operating assets. So in that standard, we are going to recognize liabilities for operating sites. So as of now, we are in the process of assessing the impact that that standard will have on our liabilities. So going forward, we might see our liability going up when we start taking into account the operating sites.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I recognize this may be a matter that's kind of complicated by who really is supposed to have that liability, whether it's tax-based municipalities in some case, or MACA, or Department of Lands, or whoever the landowner is, if it's not even GNWT lands for some of the landfills. So all of that was, I guess, will get sorted out over the next few years. Is that correct?
Mr. Kui.
Yeah, thank you. That's correct. When the new standard comes out on asset retirement obligations, we're just right now starting to analyze that standard and its impact. So until we understand the standard and can we apply it to our list of inventory and see what happens. But if I could point the member to page 20 of the consolidated statements, that would be note 11, environmental liabilities and asset retirement obligations. The member can see here where we are separating the total environmental liabilities and then asset retirement obligations that we have recorded to date, and then the total. And I think you see in the last paragraph on that note, you will see a note around what those asset retirement obligations are. That provides some information to the member. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Yep, thanks. Okay, that's helpful. I just want to turn to liabilities for GNWT liabilities associated with Giant Mine. In last year's public accounts, I think it was booked at 2.7, or in the current ones, it's $2.7 million, the ones that we're reviewing, but in the year before, it was also $2.7 million. So can someone explain to me the process by which liabilities, that money is drawn down, and when GNWT will have discharged its obligations with regard to Giant Mine liability? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kui.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The money would be drawn down as the work is done and the remediation is satisfied within the environmental standard that there's no more contamination. So right now, to the best of our knowledge, the amount that the GNP share of the giant mine would be the 2.7 million that is disclosed. There is work that is ongoing, and that's just work done by ENR staff that are currently appropriated. Right now, it's not significant enough to charge the liability that it's actually reducing the contamination, but as the member states, there is work that is ongoing. That's just done by current staff in the Department of ENR. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'll give a more specific example. The construction costs for the bypass road were used or were allocated to the $23 million of liability that GNWT incurred as a result of Giant Mine and signing the cooperation agreement with the federal government. And I think the cost of the bypass was about 11 or $15 million or something. So the remaining $2.7 million, who makes a determination about what expenses are eligible, or how, whether we give cash to the federal government, or who makes that determination about how the money is used and allocated, and what the schedule is for that? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So specific to this one project, obviously it would fall under the Giant Mine remediation project, the overall large project, but you know, as they go about their share, then, you know, we have our internal processes around all sites. So I can tell you how it works for all our sites is there's some governance committees in place that are actively, so we have our list of environmental sites that are prioritized based on risk and need and certain criteria. And then those sites are going for remediation. So that group does monitor which ones our resources should be put to first. And then we start remediating those sites first based on priority. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to leave that one alone for now. I have some other questions, but maybe I can get put back on the list. I want to talk about the student loan remission issue later. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on page 31 of Public Accounts, Section 2, it talks about claims and litigation there. Why doesn't the department provide us a list of, or is the department able to provide a list of potential claims and litigation that's happening? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We can definitely touch base with our colleagues at Justice to see what kind of list we can make available. There is a list. It would just have to be vetted to ensure that there's no, information in there that just can't be disclosed. These are ongoing litigations that are occurring, so we can take a look at what level of disclosure we can provide, and I can get back to committee. Thank you.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On Section 1 of the Consolidated Financial Statements, and I think it's on the second part, discussion and analysis. On page 19, it talks about ENR or Environment and Economic Development expenditures. There was an increase of $7 million, and it was due to the forest management fire cost. Could you please elaborate a little further? Because it did seem to be happening during that time. So could you please expand a little further?
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so the explanation we got on that is that there was $6 to $7 million more activity in forest management, wilderness costs, wildfire costs. If I can refer the member to page 41 of the Section 2. Go to page 41 of Section 2 under Environment and Natural Resources. You will see noted there under Forest Management line that there was a supplementary estimate of $6.3 million. So they did incur additional costs that were appropriated through the supplementary estimates process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you. On the same page, talks about health and social services and housing expenditures of $552 million in 2018. This was $26 million lower, but my understanding with combining all the health authorities, we're seeing an increase of cost to that. We're seeing a huger debt, and we keep on seeing a huge debt into that. So can you explain why we actually see a reduction there? In reality, we're having costs go up in this area. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe if I pointed the member again to page 42 of the non-consolidated, again, you would see that the actual Department of Health, at their main estimates of $423 million, with expenditures of $445 million, and again, you would see a large number in the supplementary appropriations of $26 million. And if you look at page 2 of the non-consolidated, again, you would see the health, social services, and housing line, a budget and expenditures that are over that budget, as the member indicates, should be the case. When it comes to consolidation, there's other entities that are involved in that line. So if you looked on page 38 of the consolidated under the health, social services, and housing, that does include the Department of Health and Social Services, all Health and Social Services Authority in the MHE, the Chilicho Community Service Agency Health portion, the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation, and the Status of Women Council. So this is based on the consolidation of all of those entities, and there are some eliminating entries, as I mentioned, on the consolidation for related parties that get backed out. So it's not a perfect math to get to this, but I think if you look at the nons, I think that's what the member indicates that he would be looking to see. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson?
Thank you. I'm just going to go to slide 10 on here, and you're talking about a student loan remissions and how it's reported in here into the report. I'm a bit concerned that we see this in there. So I guess my first question to Mr. Cooey is that did we get a legal opinion to be able to continue to do this, put their person's name or student's name into this? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we do have a legal opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. And this, of course, relates to the disclosure of those individual students who are receiving loans remissions in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you. So we talked about getting a legal opinion here, but I'm looking at the Financial Administration Act, and part of this, I think it's section 62, subsection 6, it says report of forgiveness. The forgiveness under section 2 or 5 of a debt or obligation owed to the public agency must be reported in an annual report of the public agency for that fiscal year. So where does that say that we need to put the person's name in there? Could we not just lump it all together and report it as one line? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd refer the member, I think section 62 of the FAA is more restricted to public agencies. I direct the member to section 65 of the FAA. 65 subsection B would say any forgiveness during the fiscal year under section 62 or any other enactment of a debt or obligation or part of a debt or obligation would need to be disclosed in the public accounts. So, the way we interpret that is it's very specific to debt and not debts. So we do not feel we have the ability to amalgamate those, but we do need to put them on a line-by-line basis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cooey. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you. I guess it's a difference of opinion, I guess. But my question, I guess, then is, okay, so you can report it. Can you not just report a file number instead of having a person's name on it? You're still reporting that information, but it's not being, the students or returning students are not being, identified. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our current view is that in the FAA's provisions are around transparency and accountability. So similar to a remission or a forgiveness or a write-off, we are required to list it on a line-by-line basis. On the new Schedule 11, non-consolidated schedule of student loan remissions, there is an opening paragraph in there that does state that under the student financial assistance regulations, the government may forego collection of student loans provided certain criteria are met. The students listed below, having met the academic or employment and residency criteria, have qualified it and been granted remission of their loans. So I think this sentence is supposed to say these guys have returned to the north, they have done their obligations, and they have met their obligations of what they signed up for, and have been granted remission, to provide a little more clarity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you. Okay, so in the past, we've consolidated bad debts and obligations for businesses and that, and just combined it in one sum. So why couldn't we be doing the same thing for the students then? We've already done it. We've already practiced this in other areas. And so why can't we be doing the same thing in this area? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there was a change effective April 1st, 2016, when the new Financial Administration Act was revised and came into force. Prior to that, any forgiveness or any write-off required to go through an act in the Legislative Assembly. So that act that went through in the Legislative Assembly would have had all the detail. So it would have been disclosed through that act, and then I think it was summarized in the public accounts. As of April 1st, 2016, the way it's written is around each and every one, which that's how we're interpreting it, and that's how we're interpreting going forward, that each and every one write-off, remission, or forgiveness would be disclosed in the public accounts. The difference is there's no act anymore. It is under the authority of the Financial Management Board. So if it's approved there, it is disclosed in the public accounts, which is why we want to ensure it's very transparent and disclosed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess my next question, though, is when we talk about given authority or given permission to share the information, like this is private information, when we as MLAs reach out to the departments, we have to get a third-party consent form, which means the constituent needs to give permission to do that. So has the government got permission from the students to do this from the very beginning? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's still our position that student permission is not required. There was a change to the student financial assistance form last year that gave them notification that this would be disclosed in the public accounts. So that was a change made to the form effective last year. But it is still our position that the ATIP legislation, the privacy legislation, does have a provision where this information can be disclosed if it's required by another piece of legislation. And our position is still that the FAA requires us to disclose this. So we do not see a privacy breach here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess we'll have a different opinion on that one because I think it's a breach. But so we're talking about 2016. What about the years previously? So you didn't give, they weren't informed. They didn't acknowledge that this was happening. So how were we able to do that previously in the past with this information? Thank you,
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It would still apply under the legislature, so the ATIP still has that clause about if it's required by another piece of legislation. Previously, before April 1st, 2016, they did go through their own Forgiveness Act, and they were recorded in the public accounts based on the Financial Administration Act requirements. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Certainly, there's a distinction that committee has in mind of what the government is required to do under legislation and what the government ought to be doing to protect the best interests of our citizens. And I think where the committee is coming from here is, although the legislation is written a certain way, there's a privacy concern that has been raised with members of the committee and that the committee has raised with government. We've seen you've taken a number of actions, but just so the record is very clear, the department is not of the view, and sorry, earlier you mentioned that a privacy impact assessment was completed. We have a copy of that as a committee, and we'll be looking at that, but the position of the government is as such that the Access to Information Protection and Privacy Act, the privacy rights that are defined by that act are not impacted by the disclosure of student loan remission information in the public accounts. Is that correct, Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yeah, the ATIP legislation does have a provision in it that, so we're not saying this is not private information. We believe it is private information, but it does allow for the disclosure of that information if it is required by another piece of legislation, which it is by the Financial Administration Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooey. You can expect further questions on that, I'm sure. Next on my list is Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 41 of Part 2 of Section 1 of the Public Accounts books, there's a list of the organizations or the entities which have submitted their audited financial statements. And this includes the education authorities, the health authorities, housing corporation, and so on. And I note that, and the witnesses touched on this in the opening remarks, that this is much better than we've seen in previous years in terms of the times it's taken these organizations to complete their audits and submit them. And I still have a little bit of concern because I know that the Auditor General only has a finite amount of time to look at these public accounts. And looking at some of the extensions that were required here into August, I can see that pushes back the completion of the total public accounts by a couple months, because they should have been in June, but they asked for extensions until August. One of those entities was the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority. And I understand that with the 6 entities coming together into one large health authority, they all have to consolidate their audits and then put into one. And it's my understanding that those 6 authorities are going to be moving to a single financial system in the coming year. I believe it's starting next year. And that consolidation is going to be quite a bit of work. The 6 entities are going to have to start using a different type of financial software. And I can foresee that causing some problems, and I can see that delaying the completion of the audit, which means that the Auditor General's office won't be able to look at it, and so on. So this could cause some issues. So while this doesn't relate to the 17-18 public accounts, it's looking forward. And so what is your team doing to work with the health authority to ensure that there's a smooth transition? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so the 6 authorities are coming on to the government's financial information system. That is a finance-led project within my office. So we're very engaged with the NTHSSA on this project on a day-to-day basis right now. So right now we're currently projecting to go live in early December of 2019. The member's correct. There will be some challenges with respect to the audit of the 18-19 year as we do the data conversion over to the single financial system. But I think one of the big benefits of this is that in future year audits, such as 1921, they are on one single system. The audit should be a lot simpler when all their information is especially in the government system, and it's easier for us to do the consolidation on top of that. But we are heavily involved with them on a day-to-day basis. We are discussing the impacts of data conversion of the audits and putting all that into our project plan. We are working with the Office of the Auditor General in planning for this to see how we can ensure that we get the timeframes the same going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. It's good to hear. I know that I'd assume you'd be on top of it because you guys would be the ones bearing the brunt of it if things didn't work out smoothly. So it's good to hear. The Hay River Health Authority is still a separate entity, and they have their own financial system. So are you also working with them? Because they are moving in the direction of amalgamation at some point in the future, I'd assume. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We currently aren't working directly with them, but they are a future consideration. So if at some point they did join the NTHSSA, then we would definitely look to bring them onto the financial system. And hopefully the work that we are doing now, and we're documenting as we're working with the 6 authorities to come onto our system, we would be able to leverage the learning and the best practices that we get from the work that's ongoing right now, so to bring them in hopefully on a smoother process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure they'll be experts by then, and it probably will be a smooth transition, so it's good to hear that that's also something that's being considered. Nothing further on this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. O'Reilly, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to return to the question of the student loan remission reporting. First off, I guess I want to acknowledge that the Comptroller General and his office have made changes. The reporting has changed somewhat in that student loan remissions are now found in a separate schedule. That's good. There's now a box that students have to check off on their student loan remission application forms that acknowledges that they understand that the information on the student loan remissions is going to be published as part of the public accounts. So those 2 changes have been made. They've also, our friends have also conducted a privacy impact assessment. So maybe I'll start with a privacy impact assessment. I'd like to ask, Mr. Chair, is that a public document? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is not currently a public document. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Can Comptroller General undertake to determine or check as to whether it can be made public? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, as I wasn't a signatory to it, I could check with the signatories of the document and relate that back to committee. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd also like to ask who prepared the privacy impact assessment. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The privacy impact assessment was completed by our shared corporate services section in the Department of Finance, which is our main policy unit for the department. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks. So just to be clear, it wasn't a third party, then it was an internal privacy impact assessment. Is that correct? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to know whether the Information and Privacy Commissioner, who has expressed a clear interest in this, and I believe I tabled correspondence that she had sent to the Comptroller General in the House on this issue, expressing serious concerns over what she characterized this as a breach of privacy, the publication of the students' names and amounts in the public accounts. Was the Information and Privacy Commissioner consulted in the preparation or even a draft of the privacy impact assessment? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, the Information and Privacy Commissioner was not consulted on the privacy impact assessment. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Can I have an explanation as to why that didn't happen? I know when this issue was raised before a committee, I think last year, I actually suggested that given the interest of the expressed publicly by the Information Privacy Commissioner, that she specifically actually be consulted during the preparation of this. So why didn't that happen? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, as we didn't complete the privacy impact assessment on our part, I would have to check back with the department and relay that information back to committee. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I find that kind of frustrating, but so now students check off a box on their application form. It's my understanding, and that the Information and Privacy Commissioner has characterized that practice as really coercion, and that if students want to apply for and receive the student loan remission, they have to agree to have their names and amounts published in the public accounts, which doesn't seem to be a very clear choice, an informed choice. Is there some other way in which this can be remedied? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I note that the disclosure form was changed, and that was more to give awareness. The member's correct. It's not providing consent as we think, as the legislation is currently written. There is no choice but to disclose this. So under the current legislations as written, I don't see a remedy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So just to confirm, can you just summarize briefly what the privacy impact assessment has found? I understand that it's considered a confidential document, but clearly, what were the findings of it? What's the outcome of that? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Keeping in mind that this is not a public document, I will allow the question, however, because you have addressed some of those actions that you've taken as a result of that in your presentations. Mr. Cooey?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, as it is a confidential document currently, but it did reaffirm the stance that my office is taking in that, this is maybe private information, but it is allowable to be disclosed under the privacy legislation because it is required to under the Financial Administration Act in short form. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, look, I want to recognize the efforts that the Comptroller General has made to try to find some creative solutions to deal with this issue within a very limited scope, not really dealing with the issue of privacy. And I want to acknowledge the work that they've done on this, but I don't accept that this is the end of this. I want to make it very clear that I personally still view this as a breach of privacy of these students, especially at a time when we're trying to encourage our students to come back. This disclosure of personal information, I don't believe is even required by the legislation, and I don't think it helps encourage our students come back here when their personal information is disclosed in this manner. So with all due respect, I just don't accept this practice, and I don't believe it's required in legislation, and I'll do my best to make sure that that's changed before I leave this place. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly, Mr. Cooey, do you have anything to I'll allow you to respond if you choose to.
No, I'll just take the member's response as a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooey. It's not just one member. Of course, we've been raising these concerns for a number of these, well, for the past 3 years. So although you do have, I think committee is respectful that you have a legal opinion and that you are not a minister. You are not someone who makes laws. You're someone who follows them. So we appreciate that. But at the same time, this is a serious issue, and we will continue to work as a committee to address it until it is addressed to our satisfaction. And the actions to date are an improvement, but they still don't go far enough. And I just want to be clear about that. Anything further from committee? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks. On a totally different matter. I just, has there been a management letter provided from the Auditor General to the Comptroller General? That's, I think, fairly standard practice, but I just would like to confirm that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The management letter for the 17-18 is just being finalized, I do believe, so I am expecting to get it from the Office of the Auditor General by the end of April. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, is there, so you work with the Auditor General's office in terms of the content, or they give you a draft or something, or how does that work? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, they give us a draft, including their findings and looking for management responses, or if there's anything in there that we feel is factually incorrect that we can comment on before it is officially signed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Okay, so even if it's in draft form, is there anything in there that you need or want to share with us at this point? And I'm not suggesting that there's anything, look, you got a clean audit opinion, that's great, that's even better than some provincial governments get. So I think we're doing well, and I acknowledge all the work that has been done to get us here. We've got much more detail in terms of the fiscal responsibility policy compliance, where that's great. And I acknowledge the work that's been done on P3s, but is there anything in the management letter that you want to flag for us at this point? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing specific at this time. In the management letter, they'll talk about a lot of their findings, so it'll be a lot of things that are ongoing in our internal control environment, so which is great information for myself and my office of what they find to do in our systems or in our processes that I can then take action on to ensure we have a strong internal control environment. So a lot of it is very detailed and specific, and we do definitely take action on these things. So it is a good letter for my office to have that we can incorporate to ensure that we take the right steps going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Riley?
Okay, thanks for that. And so with, I want to acknowledge that there's better and clear reporting on the P3s that were undertaken to date here. We may have another one that's emerging with what's going to happen with the old hospital building. It's going to be managed by a third party, and I guess GNWT is going to be the tenant, and there's going to be some kind of a long-term contract for the operation maintenance of the building, as I understand it. Is that going to be classified as a P3, and how will that be reported in the future? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Mupadatsi. Nope, Mupadzizwa. We'll get there sooner or later.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The old Stanton Hospital, right now we are in the process of doing an analysis of how we are going to account for it, whether it's going to be a P3 or it's going to be like a lease arrangement. Currently, there could be we see the potential for it being treated as a P3 because there are life cycle operational payments similar to any other P3 arrangement. However, the actual financing arrangement is, I think, what's going to determine how we are going to treat it, because there are a number of scenarios that we can pursue, whether GNWT will be putting more money or the partner will be putting more money. So once we do that analysis, we'll make a determination. So it's something that we think will come to a conclusion in the 2019-20 fiscal year. Because currently the cost incurred on that project is less than $1 million. So once everyone moves to the new hospital, and then they do the base building, and then we move to the tenant improvement, then we'll start accumulating costs, and we need to account for those costs properly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So stay tuned, I guess is the short of that, and I appreciate that. Thanks. It's my understanding that the NWT Health and Social Services Agency is, it's underway. The system transformation is well underway, but there's still some remaining work to be done to bring together their financial accounting systems. So would we expect to see in the next or the one after that a consolidated or one report bringing together all of that, and what involvement has your office had in helping bring that work together? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, right now they already have a consolidated financial statements. They do bring together from the 6 authorities' financial systems, and they do have a consolidated, which is audited by the Office of the Auditor General. So the purpose of the project is to, obviously, one of the benefits would be a much more streamlined audit and much more streamlined financial financial unit for the health authority. Bring them onto our system will hopefully provide them with the data that they need to make their management decisions and really leverage their business. So this project's been on the books for quite some time, and through my office as well as the Health and Social Services Department, there has been work ongoing with the health authority to standardize their processes over time to get ready for this. That work is really ramping up right now. As I mentioned, it is a finance-led project, so we are in daily contact with the NTHSSA, dealing with their financial unit and how that's gonna operate once they are onto our financial system. So it's a very intense project, and we're right in the middle of it right now. Also during year end, so it's fairly interesting. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
That's all I've got, but interesting is a good way to characterize it. I'm sure it's giving you headaches, nightmares at times, but no, I want to, I appreciate the work that's probably got to go into that, so thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. I'm wondering, Mr. Cooey, if you can tell me, based on these public accounts, what percentage of tangible capital assets acquisitions, what percentage of those are equal to our revenues? So basically, over revenues. So, how much is our jurisdiction really spending of its revenues on tangible capital assets? Mr. Cooey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, did the quick math of our 2018 actual revenues were, on a consolidated basis, 2.06 billion, and we spent 304 million on tangible capital assets in that year.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooey. In our review leading up to this hearing, we've taken a look at tangible capital acquisitions comparatively to other jurisdictions, and in working with the Auditor General as well, we understand that this is somewhere around 15% of our revenue, as a percentage of our revenues. And when you compare that with the rest of the country, it's very high. Highest of the territories, significantly higher than the provinces, which sit around 5%. It seems like this information, this level of analysis and detail comparatively is keenly aligned to the fiscal responsibility policy, which is really how to manage infrastructure expenditures, and also keenly aligned to the broader policy objectives of our estimates documents, our capital budgets, et cetera. Is this a level of analysis that could be provided in the public accounts under the financial analysis section in the Section 1 book? Mr. Cooey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if I understand the question correctly, in the financial discussion analysis, could we relay information around how much we are investing in tangible capital assets, comparing that to our revenues as well as other jurisdictions, or some sort of analysis along that lines? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, that's correct, Mr. Cooey. And it's kind of like taking a look at what debt service or what debt is compared to GDP, and those kind of higher level financial analyses that you see prepared by economic think tanks and people looking at the state of economies. If that kind of level of detail, especially comparatively to the other territories and perhaps to Canada, I'm thinking of how we can improve the level of analysis and discussion that the public and the press take in these public accounts books when they come out, and I think that's something that people can easily relate to see, where's the national standard essentially, or where are the trends going, and how do we fit into those trends, especially in regards to infrastructure, which is. There are many speeches in the House on the importance of infrastructure. It's a key public policy concern of this government, and they've made a strong case, an economic case for it. And the public accounts are really where we see where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, of those main estimates documents. So I think this kind of analysis might be helpful. And yes, is that something that you could contemplate doing a comparative analysis with other jurisdictions and to provide those kind of high-level details? Thank you. Mr. Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that is something we can consider putting in the financial statement discussion analysis on a future basis, so we can consider that in the 18-19 public accounts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cooey. Further, committee. Okay, well, thank you. Oh, and before we wrap up, I did want to note that the discussion piece on the fiscal responsibility has greatly improved as well. I think every time, again, this is another one of those things that every public accounts hearing, we understand it a bit better. And now, after many years, we have a very clear summary of how that policy works. And I think it'll be helpful to future assemblies and certainly members of the public who are trying to understand a paramount policy of the GNWT. So thank you for the work your office has done to present that information clearly and to provide it to both this committee and the public at large. And with that, I'll allow you to make any closing comments. Comptroller General.
Thank you. No, I'd just like to thank committee and staff for the past 3 years. And again, I think we've made significant progress, and working with committee on their recommendations going forward. I think the products that are out there, including the plain language public accounts document, is beneficial to our residents to help interpret these documents. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cooey. And yes, that plain language document, I believe, is available online and in print through the Department of Finance. And if anyone's interested who might be watching today online, you can find it there, and it's a fantastic document. With that, we can be adjourned.